do these lights have to be on while they really fade out well, it makes it more difficult to see, and it's much sharper if those lights are not on. I just wondered if they could be turned off. How are we doing so far? Or do you think one of them needs to be on? Okay. Well, let's do whatever we think is best and make it as sharp as we can. I think we got it focused. Phil Thomas is our speaker this morning from Ithaca, New York. Phil has been a student of the Casey teachings for many, many years, and he has developed that with some products that he will talk to you about this morning. He's spoken at the ARE councils, he's spoken in Boston, and at some U.S. Psychotronics Association meetings in Golden, Colorado, and in Virginia Beach, and areas like that. And he has some real interesting and helpful products here to talk about that were talked about years and years ago by Edgar Casey, with whom practically all of you are already familiar. So from Ithaca, New York, our lead-off speaker this morning, welcome, if you will, Phil Thomas, who's going to share with us.
Okay, I'll turn this off. Thanks, Dean and Phyllis. I'm going to move things around here a little bit because I realize it's difficult for some people to see this stuff. Is that all right up there? Yeah, I've been in Casey readings for a number of years, and about 8 years ago, I bumped into my predecessor, Lester Babcock, down in Virginia Beach, and he was the guy who was building the Casey radial active and wet cell devices. And since that time, I've been investigating them and trying to get a better insight as to what Casey was talking about and how these particular devices were used, not only in the readings, but just how they were applied in the Casey philosophy. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Casey philosophy first, if I could, because you really need a fundamental understanding of, about Edgar himself and what he was talking about, what he was trying to promote, before you really get into the devices and the different apparatus, not just the ones that I'm working with, but Edgar really talked about a number of different areas. In fact, if you take a look at it, he really talked about everything, just about. But Edgar had a basic philosophy about life and about the living condition, if you will, which he discussed sometimes in depth and at other times, you know, rather briefly. But he considered a fundamental understanding about life important before we really get into try and understand how to change the way we are. Basically, Edgar broke it down into three systems. He said that the human body was more than just one level. And in fact, he talked about three. He talked about the physical, the mental, and the spiritual bodies. Now, we all know a little bit about the physical body because this is the tangible body we all live with day to day. And that's what we look at it as and label it as, a body. But the mental and the spiritual levels are because they're not tangible in the physical plane as we relate to it with our senses, then that's a little more difficult to understand. We don't really know how to look at the mental and spiritual planes all the time. And many of us have different perspectives as to what they are and how we should be relating to them. But Casey's philosophy was basically that the physical body, the mental body, and the spiritual body were all bodies. That is to say, if we could perceive the mental body on the mental plane, it would be as the physical body is perceived on the physical plane, and likewise the spiritual body also has a body unto itself. And if we could look at these individually, what I'm trying to explain is that the physical body has counterparts on the mental and spiritual planes. So we know how to look at the physical body because that's tangible in a tangible sense. The mental body, Edgar said, also had a body, much like the physical body. And if we could see the mental body on the mental plane, then it would look similar to the physical body looks as on the physical plane. And likewise, the spiritual body on the spiritual plane. So each of these are separate bodies unto themselves, and each of us has each of the bodies, the physical, mental, and spiritual bodies. It's a point that all of us have heard, but in actuality, it's a point that probably most of us haven't really discerned in our own mind what the mental and the spiritual bodies are. So this is an important point in the Casey readings. And once we understand the three tiers, then we can better understand, or begin to better understand, how each of these bodies interact one with the other, and how we can better understand all different phases of reality, existence, life, so forth. This is important in the Casey readings because Edgar talked about this particular device, which is called the radioactive device, and harmonizing these three different bodies. Basically, he talked about the three different bodies as being out of sorts one with the other. In other words, oftentimes it would look like this, if you could see all three. And Edgar said if we can harmonize these three bodies, these three levels, then we can better understand and function all the functions that we normally do, we can do optimally or better. So Edgar had an idea that we could harmonize these three bodies, one to the other. And he said we can do this by using a device which he called the radioactive device. Now this device is designed primarily to balance frequency patterns across the body. And what it does is we have this is a basic diagram of the appliance. We have two pieces of high carbon content steel inside the device, which these terminals are attached to. And the lead wires from the terminals are attached to the extremities of the body. In other words, the wrist and the opposite ankle diagonally across the body as you use it. The idea was that the carbon steel, which is a high carbon content steel, there are two pieces here. They're the same within the device. There's an induced biomagnetic field set up between these two pieces of steel. That biomagnetic field resonates to our own overall biomagnetic field when those lead wires are attached to the extremities. In other words, there's a field within the device which resonates to the body's own overall biomagnetic field across the body when those lead wires are attached. The other prerequisite is that the device itself had to be cooled down to the temperature of ice water. That induced field resonates to the overall field, back to the device, back to the body, and essentially what it does is enables the overall frequency patterns to come within the range of the overall norm. In other words, you have high frequency patterns across the body, you have low frequency patterns across the body, and this neutral field, which is within the device, set up or induced between these two pieces of steel here, resonates to the overall frequency patterns, enables them to come within the range of the overall norm. Now, this is kind of a, well, it's kind of an unusual concept in a lot of ways at the time. Casey started talking about this back in 1915. And although there were some people working with radionics and, well, there were a lot, during the turn of the century, there were a lot of people working with a lot of different ideas. This was kind of new unto itself, and even today, you know, 90 years later, or 80, 75 years later, it still really hasn't broken the ice yet. And there wasn't really anything else out there that you could directly relate this concept to. So Casey sort of pioneered the idea, developed it himself, got it out into the field, and it sort of took on a life unto itself. Unfortunately, it was never really highly developed, and still isn't to this point. But there are a number of people that are using the device, and those people are the people that speak for the success of the device itself. The other device which I'm working with is called the wet cell. Now, the radioactive was designed to be used for, well, it has a universal design. It's a passive device, and it's designed to interact primarily with the circulatory system. But Casey realized that there were other facets to health-related issues aside from just balancing the physical, mental, and spiritual bodies. So he developed a device called the wet cell, which was designed to induce specific vibrations into the body. Now, this is an active device, and it's designed to interact primarily with the central nervous system. And being an active device, well, you have to have a fundamental understanding of what you're doing with it, and you have to know the Casey readings, in essence, because that's all we have to go on. And I guess the other point I should probably bring up is that those of you that are familiar with the Casey readings know about the dozens of books that have been written and all this stuff. But in actuality, the two devices are discussed in approximately 2,100 readings, which makes it the single most discussed health aspect aside from spinal adjustments, massage, and diet. Well, attitude. We don't want to forget that. Actually, attitude is number one consideration in the Casey readings. He almost always started out with some kind of discussion about the individual's attitude and how that was either assisting or holding them back from getting the particular results they were in need of. At any rate, the wet cell is like a single cell battery. And there are two rods placed in the solution, which I don't have, but inside the battery container itself, one is nickel, the other is copper. And it's used similarly to the radioactive in the sense that you have two terminals, you have lead wires coming off the terminals, and they're attached to the body. But this particular device was designed so that the solution itself had a charge on it. In other words, in the solution there was copper sulfate, sulfuric acid, water, and zinc, and those particular elements interacted one with the other with the rods that were in the solution to create a small charge. Now, the idea was that this charge on this battery could induce the frequency, resonant frequency pattern of a specific solution which was placed in the solution jar, which is in line with the nickel pole, okay? So the idea was that we place a solution, a liquid solution, in the solution jar, and the vibration of that specific solution via a looped coil, which was submerged in the solution when the cap was screwed on, that solution, the vibration of that particular solution could be introduced into the body. Casey talked about 6 or 8 different solutions during the course of about 1,100 readings on the wet cell, and about 90% of the time they were either gold chloride or silver nitrate. The gold having a rejuvenating vibration, and the silver being used in situations where the central nervous system was to be specifically approached. And there were some organic compounds, and for instance, I don't know, well, he used basically a very limited number of solutions in this solution jar. In other words, he considered those to be sufficient in most cases for inducing the specific vibration that was necessary. Now well, as I mentioned, the two devices were discussed in approximately 2,100 readings, which is why I initially got interested in devices, because I had studied, I had read a number of books on Casey and was interested in it for a number of years. I never really studied the health readings that much when I first got into it. Of course, I wasn't particularly interested in, but eventually, as I got to take a closer look at the readings themselves, and I began to understand that the health readings and the health perspective was not only the largest percentage of overall readings, but how Casey felt that he could reach people and actually impact some type of an effect on society as a whole. If you stop and look at it, Casey was probably right there as well. He was trying to suggest during the course of his lifetime how we can go about making a change. And there have been many people that have had access to the public's attention and whatnot, and been great orators or been extremely intelligent people or whatnot that still have failed to have a significant impact on sociological change. And Casey, perceived that it was necessary to have some type of an impact that not only was pertinent for present day, but also for long term. Casey didn't look at the immediate present as the be here and end all. He talked about evolution as a slow change, and considering the number of readings on reincarnation and that type of thing, it's easy to see why Edgar was interested in long-term change. And his particular approach was to approach it from a health perspective, whereby people could see physically in a tangible way that they could relate to the change in their own life, and then consequently, and hopefully the mental and spiritual bodies also would follow along. This is transparency on the polarities within the body. In essence, the human body is much like the Earth in the sense that we have a positive pole, or let's say opposite poles, but I'm going to distinguish between positive and negative. I don't mean to make a connotation, but the positive pole will designate above the body here and the negative pole here. And in essence, the body is much like the physical planet itself. And if you stop and look at it, I think it's pretty obvious that, the microcosm and the macrocosm and that stuff, there are some distinctive correlations we can draw there. Not only the poles, but also the axis and alignment. And once you start taking a look at that, then you begin to understand and perceive a little better, how we relate or correlate to nature itself, and the Earth. But it's important. The other thing is that it's important to take a look at the polarities here across the body and the dynamics, and that also falls in line with what Casey had to say about the attachment of the lead wires from the extremities, always diagonally across the body. This transparency is just about gone, but I'll tell you what this says in case you can't read it. Casey also talked about the chakras, if you will, and the correlation of vibration and frequency pattern to the specific chakras. Now, he made an analogy with a stringed instrument, or I think he talked about a violin or something, but at any rate, a stringed instrument whereby the string is strung and you touch it ever so lightly, and the movement that you have is the first frequency pattern, in other words, the first chakra. That's the one at the bottom. Can't read it. If you continue to strike the string or hit it a little harder, the second level that you get, or the result after movement, is sound. The third level, if you continue to strike it more violently, if you will, if the string continues to vibrate at a higher and higher level, then it begins to produce heat. And from there, we move in the fourth chakra, which is light, the fifth electrical, sixth magnetic, and finally the odic, which is correlated to the crown chakra. Now these were, like I mentioned, frequency patterns, as Casey explained them, correlated to the chakras. And Casey also discussed this as far as his overall health perspective, and how the chakras, the frequency levels, were related to each individual's health. These two devices fall somewhere in the range of, well, the radioactive device falls in the magnetic range because it's a biomagnetic device. The wet cell, which actually has a small charge on it, falls in the range of the fifth chakra, which is the electrical. And all the other levels were also talked about. The lower ones, not so much with devices and that type of thing, but more with massage, colonics, spinal adjustments. There were a number of different approaches that Casey used. And those of you familiar with Casey readings know he wasn't particularly interested in surgery and drugs and that type of thing. So basically what he was doing was laying out some type of a format whereby we could treat the physical condition, the mental condition, and the spiritual condition, and some type of a holistic approach. These two devices were particularly important with the Casey, not just because he talked about them so much, which he did, but you know, he was trying to develop some type of a approach to treat conditions in a way that were non-invasive, or where you could get some kind of a long-term result, where people can actually get healing on the physical, mental, and spiritual levels. Lots of times, there's a lot of different facets to this, aside from these particular two devices. But what we're trying to do here is approach these, this specific condition, if you will, in some type of a holistic manner, whereby we can get the healing without having some kind of a negative impact on it. And once in a while, Casey would actually recommend surgery, although I don't ever recall him recommending drugs. If somebody came in and he understood that they obviously were not going to follow his instructions, or it was somebody was in dire need of surgery right then and there or something like that. But as a rule, he always tried to approach it from a holistic perspective. And he felt that if we wanted to get real healing, then what we needed to do was take care of it ourselves and stay away from drugs and surgery. As I mentioned, the Radioactive is a passive device which is designed to interact with the circulatory system. Once the device is cooled down, then the lead wires were attached to the device and then to the extremities of the body, like the wrist and the pulse, at the ankle, diagonally across the body. And then each time you use the device, you'd rotate those lead wires around the body so that after 4 uses, you'd have a uniform exposure. Now, the wires were color-coded, and so were the terminals, so you could keep it straight. And the idea was that that field resonating across the body via the your own circulatory system, interacting with your own circulatory system, could balance, stabilize your overall frequency patterns, enabling the body to do, well, essentially enabling the body to do all things better. Now, this was a universal design, universal application, and indeed, each person that uses one has a different reaction or response to it, because each of us being individuals are different. So, what we ended up with, and what I've seen in my work during the past 8 years with these devices, is different people having different response, which makes it even more difficult to scientifically assess and accumulate data or do any kind of clinical studies or that type of thing. Although, as hard as I've tried to get some studies started on some kind of legitimate scientific basis, I really haven't had any luck. Like I say, my interest really stemmed from the fact that there were so many readings on the device, and I already had a fundamental understanding about the Casey readings. But as I get more and more interested and continue to get feedback from the people that have the devices, I'm beginning to see really how universal it is. And if the design is correct and the device is doing what I feel it is, then it also can be developed. That is to say, this is as far as it's gotten so far, because very limited number of people have worked with the concept, and the idea and the concept and the technology also will evolve as time goes on. Eventually, I think what we'll all end up doing is stop using tools and instruments, and we'll just be able to do it, change the physical condition mentally by allowing ourselves to, open up spiritually. But until that time comes, and it may be several thousand years, we'll continue to use tools and approach it in the best way that we know how. So that's a brief rundown on the two devices. And of course, there's an awful lot in the Casey readings that is correlated to this because there are so many readings on the device. And the basic philosophy of the Casey readings is also quite extensive. But really what Casey was trying to do was simplify and make it accessible and available for people so that they themselves could take charge of their own lives, make their own decisions, be responsible for themselves. But rather than ramble on, why don't I just open it up for some questions? And
do the devices have any effect?
Sure. I've been working, like I say, with the radioactive and the wet cell for about 8 years, and the wet cell for about 3 years. This is, like I say, an active device, so I've been very careful with this. You could induce virtually any type of vibration into the body with the wet cell. So it's the type of thing where you sort of have to be careful with it and how it's used and the induction into the system. As far as your question goes, which was, do they affect people? Sure. I mean, I've got about 1,000 of these in the field right now, and I've had many people tell me, you know, report back many different responses. Anything from being able to sleep for the first time in many years to their natural hair color returning to them. I've had people that have been on drugs for many years take themselves off of drugs because they've used this device. It's a passive device, so it's one of those things where you have to make your own decisions, and you have to take responsibility for your own life. It's not going to force it on you. But if you allow your body to work with the stabilizing effect, then it can assist the body in virtually any type of healing process that you might imagine. In the back?
How does the wet cell differ from Eric Powell's automotive?
I'm not really familiar with his device. Gentlemen?
Aren't you, the wet cell isn't really a homeopathic device in the sense that the electric current is acting as a carrier for the vibrations from whatever is in the solution there, and so that you're talking homeopathy. I mean, you have modern equivalent of that is what has been practiced in Germany, the Dermatron, using electroacupuncture by Vol, or in this country now the Entero. Those devices where you're putting the particular vibrations into the body, the same as this. In other words, this seems to be a precursor to the so-called new homeopathic devices.
Well, it's true. The interesting part about Casey's work is that he combined a number of different ideas and then simplified it. There are a number of different people, all the way from, you know, Mesmer 300 years ago right on up to you know, Reich a few years ago, that were working with similar ideas and developing different concepts. And Casey seemed to be able to meld these different ideas together, combine them, and then reduce them to their simplest form. So I think what he's done here is supplied us with an approach which is a little bit archaic in a sense, but may very well be the best overall holistic approach to vibratory induction, like you say, this inducing a specific vibration in the body in the most holistic manner we can, at least maybe to this point. Ma'am?
You mentioned that you usually do a set 4 alternating. If after this 4 you get interrupted somehow, say you start another set a week later or whatever, and then you can only do 2, and then you get interrupted like for 2 days, is it okay then to just pick up as if you were continuing, or is there any harm in that?
The question is, you know, if you get out of sync with your cycle, in other words, you know, the polarity is set up and such, and the wires are designated as such that you should use it 4 times in a row to have uniform exposure. And this is true, you know, and the body knows this. One of the ways that you can sort of over-adjust yourself or abuse the use of the device is to use the same wire on the same extremity, let's say 2 or 3 or 4 times in a row, because then you're over charging one side of the body. But if you put it down for a couple of days and then you pick it back up and you use it again, you should just continue with the cycle that you were using. You know, after a week or so, the body would probably balance itself out. Gentleman in the back?
What is you're talking about vibratory frequencies and so forth. What is the frequency range that you encounter, and how do you measure them, and what's their intensity in any unit that you care to use?
Well, I use this terminology because I feel it best gives a feel for what Edgar was talking about or trying to relate. However, as far as the frequency range itself, In essence, what we're talking about here is a subtle energy. This is not an electrical device. This is a biomagnetic device. There's no current per se across these terminals. All it does is interact with your own overall biomagnetic field. And different people have labeled that type of energy. Eamon called it the X-force. Reich, I think, called it cosmic energy. I mean, different people have talked about this particular life force, if you will, with different labels. But, and in essence, the difference between that and electricity would be electricity could travel the length of this wire almost instantly. But the X-force or the cosmic force, or whatever you want to call it, that travels the length of this wire, which is that life force within us, actually may take a couple of minutes to travel the length of this wire. The wet cell, being distinctive from the radioactive device, is a device that does have a small charge across terminals. So this is actually a curative device. This is a balancing device. This is a curative device. And by inducing specific vibrations into the body, we are getting into the range of a small amount of current. In other words, you have to have current across these terminals in order to induce the specific vibration and have it interact with the central nervous system.
When you say current, do you actually mean electrical current, or what kind of current are you talking about?
There is DC current across these two terminals when the solution.
That's on the passive device, right?
That's on the wet cell, which is the active device, yes.
That's just acting the carrier for the other vibration.
Ma'am?
Security.
I just got a device a couple weeks ago. In fact, I haven't started using it. But instead of ice cubes, Casey's time out, maybe all he knew was ice cubes. But in my freezer, I have a plastic with a liquid in that either for a headache or something that you can put on your head. I was wondering if you could wrap that device in that plastic, in that thing, instead of having them empty ice cubes.
Well, Edgar talked about ice and water. He said that both were necessary, and for whatever reason, I believe him. I think
You need the water.
I think so. That was one of the first questions I asked my predecessor. The first time I heard him speak, about, I don't know, it's been 9 years, I think. I was down at the beach and I walked into Marshall's, which is right across from the ARE, and there he was speaking to the lunchtime crowd. I had no idea who this guy was, but I was just taken by this. And I went up to him after he had finished and I said, well, what about this? Do you need ice and water? Because at that point, I was trying to judge, how esoteric is this? And he said, yes, you do. You need both.
Another thing is, he gave that thing, that device, and then he has the thing with the jar. He didn't have that, but he attached the thing with the jar to that thing.
The solution jar. Yeah, the solution jar essentially could be used with any type of radionic or what's commonly becoming to be known as biocircuit. Leslie Patton put out a book called Biocircuits, where she works with Eamon's research. He was a British researcher, contemporary of Casey's. I don't think they knew each other. But it's a much more simplistic layout where you just use copper screens and you lay over the copper screens, and then you have wires attached from the copper screens to the various polarities. And in that circuit, you can use a solution jar. It does essentially the same thing. And there's other types of circuits and biocircuits. And when you get into radionics, then you're talking about transmitting energy without the use of wires. So, and then from there it gets into areas where you're talking about negating time and space, where time and space don't even have any, they're not even barriers anymore. So what I try and suggest is that people begin with the fundamentals and then, branch out. And in actuality, probably Casey's single most strong point is the fact that he's introduced so many people to a fundamental understanding, and from there, people have gotten interested in different areas or different things that they found interesting. Anybody else? I'm going to be around for the conference, so if you got questions, I realize this is a little bit off the cuff. It's unusual in a lot of ways, and it's new information to some of you. So, yeah.
I think Casey also mentions that you should expose the increased device to the sun as often as you can. If you do that, do you have to do it outside, or can it be through the window?
Yeah, you can charge through.
Did you repeat the question?
She wanted to know, because the radioactive device is a battery in essence. In other words, it has a charge on it, and then as you use it, it becomes discharged. You have to place it in sunlight to recharge it. And she wanted to know if you can charge it through the window, which you can. It's not as good of a charge because most glass has iron in it and different minerals and whatnot that tend to pull out some of the UV and that type of thing. But you can get a charge on it. In fact, even diffuse light, indirect light, usually where I live, I don't have any direct light in the winter. But it charges up anyways. I mean, as long as you get some natural light. It wouldn't charge up in here. In fact, these lights are detrimental. So if there's not any more questions, I don't know if everybody got a flyer or not, but if you didn't and you'd like one, you can give me your name and address and I'll send you some information. Or if you want further information, I'll send you some. My address is on the back there. And I'll be around for the weekend, so let's talk it over. Thanks a lot for coming.